Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt faced an unprecedented provocations from the liberal reporter. A hush fell over the city of Washington, D.C. as news broke of a monumental legislative push from the newly elected administration. The White House planned to unveil a sweeping infrastructure renewal bill said to be the largest infrastructure investment in American history. It promised not just roads and bridges, but a comprehensive rethinking of energy, transportation, and digital connectivity. Rumors swirled that it would also include significant funding for green initiatives, a hallmark of the president's campaign pledges. Amid the swirl of excitement, a new face rose to the forefront. Karoline Leavitt, the president's newly appointed White House press secretary. Young, poised, and notoriously unflappable, Leavitt was said to combine the calm of a seasoned diplomat with the fierce loyalty of a trusted advisor. She arrived on the scene just as the White House braced itself for an onslaught of public scrutiny over the bill, scrutiny that would come from all corners, left and right. But no one in the press pool loomed larger than James Harrington, a liberal-leaning reporter from the Tribune. Over the years, he had gained a reputation for pushing boundaries, sometimes to the point of theatrical disruption. His ideological bent was complicated by his relentless thirst for drama. He had once famously shouted over a press secretary during a foreign policy briefing, nearly getting himself ejected, and then used the footage to paint himself as a victim of government intimidation. Now, with a new administration, Harrington saw fresh opportunity. If the Infrastructure Renewal Bill indeed aimed to transform the nation's energy landscape, he was determined to find the administration's weak spots. And if he had to create a scene to get there, so be it. This is the story of how these two forces, Karoline Leavitt, the iron composure behind the White House podium, and James Harrington, the self-styled champion of the unheard truths, collided in a struggle that tested the limits of civility, ambition, and the very nature of democracy. The James S. Brady press briefing room brimmed with reporters, bright lights, and the electric hum of cameras and microphones. It was the first official briefing to address the rumored Infrastructure Renewal Bill. Karoline Leavitt, a silhouette against the deep blue drape, emerged right on schedule, 2 p.m. sharp. She wore a tailored black blazer and managed a measured smile. "Good afternoon," she began, scanning the room with an air of calm control. "Thank you all for joining us. Today, I'll provide an overview of the President's plans for the Infrastructure Renewal Bill. We believe this legislation will create millions of new jobs, modernize our transportation networks, upgrade water systems, expand broadband to underserved communities, and invest in cleaner technologies to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels." After my opening statement, I'm happy to take your questions. A hush, the collective shuffling of notes. Reporters had heard rumors for weeks. Now was their chance to confirm details. Karoline read a succinct statement. Her crisp enunciation and calm tone signaled confidence. The plan was ambitious, bridging everything from crumbling roads to advanced broadband, from solar power expansions to high-speed rail lines. After her statement ended, the forest of raised hands appeared. She pointed to a reporter from the Post who asked about the bill's total price tag and how the White House intended to fund it. Karoline responded in measured detail, referencing the administration's budget office projections and a mix of proposed tax adjustments on top earners and corporations. She took a few more questions, each answered with the same unwavering composure. Then, in the third row, a tall, dark-haired man stood, James Harrington. He didn't wait to be called. "Infrastructure Renewal Bill, Ms. Leavitt," he said, voice carrying over the heads of other reporters. "How about some honesty? Isn't it true the administration is already compromising core green provisions to appease moderate senators? Or will you deny that, too?" Karoline's lips pressed into a thin line. She recognized the face, James Harrington, the notorious agitator. "Thank you for your question, James," she said gently, controlling the tension in her voice. "I will address concerns about the bill's climate provisions, but please raise your hand and wait to be called. We have a system here." He cut in, raising his voice. "I don't recall you being so formal with other reporters. Is this how you plan to muzzle inconvenient questions?" A murmur spread through the room. Some reporters glance sideways, sensing Harrington's typical tactic: provoke a confrontation, get ejected, become the story. Karoline nodded coolly at a press aide to keep distance. "James, you will be given a turn. Let me finish with the recognized reporter's question first." One of the network correspondents near him tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit. Harrington held his ground, gaze locked on Karoline. After a full 3 seconds of silent standoff, he finally sank into his seat. Karoline proceeded to answer the previously recognized reporter's question, something about broadband allocations to rural areas. She never lost her stride, but she could feel Harrington's eyes on her, waiting, eager for the slightest sign of vulnerability. When she wrapped up, she deliberately turned to Harrington. "Now, James, please go ahead." He stood, a triumphant glint in his eye. "You say this bill is transformative. Progressive lawmakers claim it's watered down to placate big corporations. Leaks suggest that a major chunk of these climate investments are short-term corporate tax credits with little accountability. Are you going to confirm or deny that the White House is giving corporate lobbyists an easy out?" Karoline's expression never cracked. The bill's structure has been vetted by economists and climate experts. It aims to incentivize private sector partnerships while ensuring accountability. We're not in the business of writing blank checks to corporations. Every tax credit is performance-based, tied to measurable environmental standards. Harrington snorted. "Performance-based. Doesn't that phrase let polluters wiggle out of actual regulation by claiming token efforts?" She held his gaze. "Not at all. These credits require verifiable results, emissions reduction targets, renewable energy usage, job creation in clean technologies. If corporations fail to meet those targets, they don't get the credits. It's straightforward." Harrington scribbled on his notepad, but anyone watching could see it was less about the answer and more about performance. "I'll hold you to that," he said ominously. When the briefing ended, Harrington lingered, presumably hoping to corner Karoline in a hallway confrontation. But White House aides swiftly ushered the press out. For Karoline, it was a first taste of the man's tactics. Loaded accusations delivered with theatrical flair, all to elicit a slip-up or heated reaction. She refused to play along. The days that followed introduced the world to an increasingly visible face-off. The White House unleashed a coordinated media campaign promoting the Infrastructure Renewal Bill's big ideas: roads, rails, broadband, green energy. Meanwhile, Harrington wrote scathing editorials accusing the administration of spin, greenwashing, and appeasing corporate donors. Cable news latched onto Harrington's hyperbole. Some anchors invited him on air to elaborate. He repeated claims from unnamed senior sources about last-minute changes to the bill. No one knew if those sources existed or if Harrington was embellishing. But it made for sensational headlines, and Harrington craved the attention. Karoline, by contrast, maintained calm. She appeared on Sunday talk shows, systematically countering each rumor. She insisted the White House had no intention of gutting the bill's climate provisions. "We're forging a path forward that invests in America's future," she told one interviewer. "We welcome scrutiny. This is a democracy. But we won't let baseless accusations derail serious policy." Behind closed doors, staffers admired Karoline's poise. Yet they privately worried about Harrington's doggedness. He courted chaos in the briefing room, often speaking out of turn. If security ever escorted him out, he'd spin it as a crackdown on free speech. Lucy Patterson, Karoline's junior aide, offered frequent updates. He's calling it a fiasco. He claims we're hiding data on job creation in pipeline sectors. Should we put out a statement? Karoline sometimes responded, "No." Harrington feeds on reaction. Let's remain factual and on message. Complicating matters, the Infrastructure Renewal Bill itself became a battleground for 3 major factions. 1. Progressives who wanted a Green New Deal style approach with no concessions to fossil fuels. 2. Moderates, both Democrat and Republican, who prioritized bridging political divides and controlling federal spending. 3. Conservatives, who claimed the bill was an overreach and threatened to filibuster unless provisions were rolled back. Within the White House, Karoline deftly managed press queries about each faction's concerns. She offered measured statements about bipartisanship, acknowledging the bill was a compromise in progress. Meanwhile, Harrington hammered away at the notion that compromise meant sellout. He wrote a piece accusing Karoline of orchestrating spin to muzzle climate advocates, citing progressive staffers who felt the bill didn't go far enough. A rumor soon surfaced on progressive blogs that the White House might accept a bridge fuel provision, funneling partial funding into natural gas to appease Republicans. Karoline again insisted no such compromise had been finalized. Harrington latched onto the rumor, calling it a preemptive betrayal. His questions in the press room turned more combative. He'd shout over colleagues or interject out of turn. "Stop lying, Ms. Leavitt. Tell the American people how much you're giving to the gas industry." Security watched with hawk eyes, waiting for a signal from Karoline. She never gave it. Instead, she calmly repeated her stance. "No final decisions on transitional fuel have been made. We remain committed to a green future." Harrington would huff, scribble furiously, and then storm out. Off the record, Lucy Patterson confided to Karoline, "He's ramping up. If you slip once, he'll pounce." Karoline only nodded. "I won't slip. This bill matters too much." As the bill neared its first big legislative hurdle, a Senate committee hearing, Harrington plotted a fresh tactic. He arrived early to the day's press briefing, nabbing a front-row seat. Usually, front-row chairs were reserved for major networks, but Harrington sweet-talked a junior staffer into letting him take it, claiming he had urgent material to present. Karoline walked in, greeting the crowd. She began detailing the White House's perspective on proposed amendments. Harrington fidgeted theatrically, rustling papers. After 5 minutes, he stood and waved a folder. "Harrington, Ms. Leavitt, I have documents showing the White House has held closed-door meetings with fossil fuel lobbyists. Will you deny these meetings ever took place?" Other reporters groaned at his timing. Karoline hadn't even finished her initial remarks. She paused, face serene. "James, I'll take your question once I conclude my statement. Please respect the process." He didn't sit. "So, no comment? This is how you hide from the truth." Karoline inhaled slowly, ignoring the jibe. She continued her statement about the Senate committee hearing, emphasizing the bill's potential to create green jobs. Harrington, still standing, looked around as if expecting security to move him. They didn't. Karoline calmly plowed forward. At last, she said, "Now I'll open the floor to questions. James, I see your folder. Go ahead." He coughed, scanning the room for maximum effect. "These files," he said, tapping them, "detail repeated visits by representatives from the American Petroleum Council to senior White House staff. We have no record of progressive climate advocates getting the same FaceTime. Isn't this bill just a backroom deal with big polluters?" Karoline nodded. "Lobbyists for various sectors request meetings. That's standard in policy formation. We also meet with environmental groups, climate scientists, labor unions, any stakeholder who wants to discuss the bill. No single group dictates policy." Harrington raised his voice. "That's not an answer. Are you or are you not colluding with fossil fuel interests?" Several reporters frowned. One hissed, "Dude, let her finish." But Harrington was unstoppable. He stepped forward, nearly crossing the press pool boundary. "If you won't level with the public, maybe you should just admit you're too afraid to debate me openly." That was the moment security hovered behind him, uncertain whether to intervene. Karoline studied Harrington's posture. He wanted a confrontation. She refused to give it. "The White House meets a wide range of stakeholders," she reiterated. "That includes all forms of energy producers and climate organizations. It's public record. If you want specifics, file a FOIA request or speak to the legislative liaison. We're not hiding anything." Harrington glared, his posture deflating slightly at her composed refusal to escalate. "I see," he muttered, sinking into the seat. He scrawled notes, likely already spinning the moment for his next piece, painting Karoline as a stooge for big oil. Behind the professional facade, Karoline felt the strain. Late nights at the White House blurred into dawn meetings. The bill's success felt uncertain. Moderate Republicans wanted cuts to the green budget progressives demanded an all-renewables approach. The White House walked a tightrope. Karoline spoke daily with the president's chief of staff, Melanie Crane, who oversaw negotiations. "Melanie, if we reduce the green portion too much, we lose the progressive base," Karoline cautioned. "And Harrington's fueling that narrative." Crane nodded, exasperated. "We're well aware. But without at least some compromise, we can't break a Senate filibuster. Keep the press calm while we find a workable deal." Lucy quietly confided in Karoline that the staff dreaded Harrington's next moves. He's rumored to have a source inside the White House. He claims they feed him partial drafts of the bill. That could be damaging if he cherry-picks phrases. Karoline's gaze hardened. If he's trying to sabotage negotiations with leaked misinformation, we'll keep repeating the facts. Panic only gives him leverage. In these intense weeks, Karoline had one advantage. The president trusted her implicitly. He rarely gave press conferences himself, preferring to let Karoline handle the daily grind. She had broad latitude to shape the administration's narrative. But that also meant if she faltered, the bill's entire public image might crumble. The tension spiked when a progressive caucus of Democratic senators declared they wouldn't support the bill unless it cut off any possibility of new fossil fuel subsidies. Conservative senators threatened to filibuster if the bill mandated steep emissions reductions. The White House faced an impossible equation, both sides demanding concessions that contradicted each other. It was a prime environment for Harrington's brand of chaos. He published a bombshell piece titled, "Leavitt's Grand Deception: Why the White House Has Already Sold Out the Planet." The article was filled with sensational quotes from unnamed staffers about softening green language and private pledges to the gas industry. Even if some staffers had given him real info, Harrington weaved it into a sweeping condemnation that portrayed Karoline as a young spin doctor orchestrating a greenwashing farce. At the next press briefing, the seats were full, with every major network itching for a confrontation. Karoline opened by calmly refuting the article's claims. There is no secret betrayal of the climate. The bill invests hundreds of billions of dollars in renewables, battery tech, and public transportation. We remain committed to net zero goals. Claims to the contrary are unsubstantiated rumors. Harrington stood, ignoring protocol again. "I'll show you unsubstantiated, Ms. Leavitt. Explain this memo." He held up a single printed page, dated last week, referencing a bridge fuel carve-out. "So you're funneling tax credits to polluters, correct?" Karoline recognized the partial text, a snippet from an internal discussion about transitional strategies. "James, that's one excerpt from a draft. We evaluate multiple scenarios. Nothing final has been decided. We're not funneling money to polluters. We are discussing ways to transition away from coal and heavy oil, potentially with short-term natural gas bridging. All of it is subject to strict oversight." He stepped closer, voice rising. "Short-term bridging is code for indefinite subsidies, a foot in the door for big gas." She held her stance. The bill includes sunset clauses. If gas projects fail to meet emissions targets, they lose federal support. We won't allow indefinite reliance on fossil fuels. This is the type of structured transition climate experts have recommended. Harrington barked a laugh. "Which experts? The ones on your corporate payroll?" A press aide stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, you're out of order." Harrington turned, camera phone in hand, pointing at the aide. "Oh, so you're going to drag me out now? Perfect. Live demonstration of White House transparency." He turned the camera on himself, adopting an outraged expression. Karoline raised her hand. "No one is dragging you out, James. But I won't allow you to hijack this briefing. If you have more questions, please wait your turn. If you choose not to, we can proceed without you." The standoff lasted a tense moment. Then Harrington slumped into his seat, muttering, "Typical," hiding behind protocol. Karoline resumed the Q&A with other reporters, who asked about job creation figures and the bill's timetable. By steadfastly refusing to engage Harrington's theatrics, she denied him the public martyrdom he craved. Yet his stories continued to gain traction among critics who suspected the White House was caving on climate. Capitol Hill began final hearings on the bill, inviting White House officials to testify. Karoline, unusual for a press secretary, was called to discuss the administration's communications and public outreach. She anticipated Harrington would be lurking. She was right. After her testimony, where she stressed that the White House had kept the public informed, Karoline stepped into the marble halls of the Rayburn office building. Standing beside a statue of a past speaker, Harrington waited, microphone ready, cameraman at his side. As soon as Karoline neared, he blocked her path. "Harrington, will you finally admit the bill's green energy portion is gutted? Or do you still insist on this fantasy?" Karoline tried to sidestep. "Excuse me, James. I have another appointment." He thrust the mic closer. "The American people deserve an answer, Ms. Leavitt. Why do you fear the truth?" A plainclothes security officer edged toward them. Harrington saw this and raised his voice. "Let them haul me away for daring to question the White House." "Go on, do it." Karoline grimaced. This was exactly the scene Harrington wanted. "I'm not instructing anyone to remove you. I simply have a tight schedule. If you want answers, watch my testimony. It's all on record." He wagged a finger. "Coward. You talk about transparency, but you run from real questions." Karoline exhaled sharply. Then she faced him, expression stony. "Fine. You want a quote? Here it is. The bill invests more in clean energy than any legislation in our nation's history. We have not gutted the climate portion. Yes, we're discussing limited transitional measures because that's how we pass laws in a divided Congress. If you have a better approach to instantly convert the entire economy overnight, James, run for office. Now, if you'll excuse me." She brushed past. Harrington's cameraman captured the entire exchange, focusing on Karoline's forced calm. He posted a snippet online with the caption, "Leavitt storms off when pressed for specifics." In reality, it was a measured exit, but Harrington spun it as a meltdown. Back at the White House, staffers were on edge. Harrington's sensational coverage was fueling online conspiracies that the bill was some corporate Trojan horse. Progressives blasted the White House for rolling back climate ambition, while moderate lawmakers threatened to drop support if the bill swung too far left. Inside the press office, the mood turned grim. Lucy Patterson noticed the toll on Karoline. "You look exhausted. Maybe skip tomorrow's briefing. Let a deputy handle it." Karoline shook her head. "No, I have to show I'm not rattled. Harrington wants me to back down. I won't." Indeed, Harrington's articles were intensifying. He gave the bill a mocking moniker, Fossil Future Bill, and wrote editorials screaming about massive gas subsidies. Some mainstream outlets fact-checked his claims, showing they were exaggerated, but the damage was done. The narrative of a compromised climate bill took hold among certain segments of the public. Meanwhile, conservative media used Harrington's angle ironically, praising him for exposing leftist hypocrisy while claiming the bill was still too large and irresponsible. Karoline found herself attacked from both extremes. Each day, she faced a barrage of questions from anxious staffers about how to control the story. She repeated, "Stay calm, keep offering real data, and never stoop to personal attacks." In a last-ditch effort to secure votes, Senate leaders hammered out a compromise. A smaller green portion than progressives wanted, plus a short-term allowance for natural gas plants under strict emission caps. The White House accepted it reluctantly because it was that or watch the bill fail. President Collins ordered Karoline to present it as a balanced approach. Harrington had a field day. "This is exactly what I warned about," he declared in a special editorial. He labeled the White House cowards for pandering to big energy interests, while also claiming they lied about rejecting such concessions. Karoline geared up for the mother of all press briefings. The mood in the James S. Brady press briefing room was tense. She read an official statement. "The president believes we must make progress rather than let perfect be the enemy of good. This bill, even with transitional measures, represents the largest commitment to green technology in U.S. history." The room erupted in questions. Karoline let them come in turn, addressing each with her trademark calm. Then Harrington seized his moment. "Harrington, so, Ms. Leavitt, you finally admit what I said from day one. that you'd capitulate to fossil fuel donors. Does the president plan to thank me for exposing your deception? A ripple of disapproval from other reporters. Karoline responded, voice level. That's an unfair mischaracterization. Our bill invests over $400 billion in renewables and advanced transit. The portion for natural gas is tightly capped. We have not capitulated. We've compromised because that's how legislation works. Harrington smirked. Compromise? More like a betrayal. Will you come clean that you misled the public about having no fossil fuel carve-outs? She drew a slow breath. I said from the start, we would not compromise the bill's core climate goals. We have not. This is still a major leap forward for clean energy. The transitional gas portion is limited to 5 years and subject to emission thresholds. If they fail, they lose funding. He slammed a hand on his seat's armrest. So now you're the climate police? The White House is going to ensure these thresholds are enforced. She nodded. Yes, we are. We intend full oversight. That's in the bill's text. It's public record. Harrington shook his head, exhaling dramatically. Let history judge. You can't say I didn't warn you all. With that, Karoline moved on, ignoring his theatrics. Her refusal to escalate left him glaring at his phone, presumably tweeting that the White House was still stonewalling the truth. With the Senate's filibuster broken thanks to that compromise, the bill moved to the House for final passage. Progressive lawmakers fumed. Some threatened a no vote, calling a sellout. But the administration worked the phones hard, pointing to the bill's still historic green funding. Eventually, enough progressives held their noses and agreed to pass it. The final margin was tight, but the bill passed the House. That same evening, Harrington posted a blistering article, Democracy Dies in Capitulation. He singled out Karoline as the charming face of corruption, who had lulled the public with empty promises. He also teased exclusive footage from White House briefings that prove he was targeted by staff for speaking up. In reality, the footage just showed Harrington's repeated interruptions and attempts to bait security. But with selective editing, he made it seem like staffers were unfairly silencing him. Social media lit up. Harrington's supporters lauded him as a truth-teller hounded by a manipulative press secretary. Karoline saw the clip. She set her jaw. He's twisting everything, she murmured to Lucy. But let him. People who watch the full briefings know better. 2 days later, the president signed the Infrastructure Renewal Bill into law on the South Lawn. Rows of seats lined the grass, with cameras capturing the moment. Karoline introduced the president at a small podium. Today, we witness a major step toward cleaner energy, improved transportation, and a more connected America, she declared calmly, ignoring the swirl of detractors. The president then gave a short speech, praising bipartisan cooperation. A hush fell as he signed the bill, cameras clicking. Applause from supporters overshadowed grumbles from a handful of progressive activists in attendance. Immediately after, a press scrum formed around Karoline. Harrington, microphone in hand, shoved forward. Ms. Leavitt, he shouted over the crowd. Will you look Americans in the eye and call this bill a win for the climate, even though it literally funds new gas infrastructure? She turned, a polite but firm smile in place. I'll call it exactly what it is, a historic investment in roads, bridges, broadband, and yes, green energy. The natural gas portion has time limits and emission standards. Everything else dwarfs it in scale. He pressed closer. That spin. You're giving billions to polluters. One of the Secret Service agents stepped between them. Harrington whipped out his phone camera, panting theatrically. So you're forcibly removing me for asking questions, huh? Karoline tapped the agent's arm lightly. He's fine, she said quietly. Then, with a steady tone directed at Harrington. No, you're not being removed. I have other reporters to speak to. I suggest you respect that. Harrington tried to follow her as she moved to greet another cluster of journalists, but the agent extended an arm to stop him from physically crowding her. Harrington turned to his camera again. They're stifling my free speech. See, this is how the White House treats real questions. Karoline answered the other journalists politely, never glancing at Harrington. He eventually gave up, walking away to record a video about White House intimidation. But the cameras from major networks showed a different story. Harrington had tried to force a confrontation. Karoline had simply defused him again. Fast forward a year. The Infrastructure Renewal Bill was in effect. Projects broke ground across the country. Some highways repaired, new rail lines funded, broadband expansions in rural zones, and large-scale solar and wind farms under development. Emissions from coal plants began trending down, replaced in part by advanced natural gas facilities that were mandated to meet strict standards. Progress was incremental, too slow for some, too fast for others. Karoline Leavitt stood at the White House podium once more. 1 year ago, the president signed the Infrastructure Renewal Bill into law, she said to the press. Today, we celebrate tangible results. 5,000 miles of roads upgraded, nearly 3,000 EV charging stations installed, new wind farms powering entire counties. We see real change. Hands shot up. First question came from a mainstream network anchor about the ongoing oversight of the bill. Karoline explained the newly formed Federal Infrastructure Commission's role in enforcing compliance. Then, inevitably, Harrington stood, this time near the back, his face twisted with disdain. Harrington, Ms. Leavitt, you never mentioned that natural gas usage has also increased, possibly offsetting some benefits. How do you justify propping up fossil fuels while calling yourself green? A mild hush. Karoline answered without skipping a beat. Yes, in some regions, transitional gas facilities are up, but we're phasing out coal at a faster rate. The net emissions are declining overall. Long-term, the bill invests heavily in renewables that will surpass gas capacity. This is a multi-step journey, James. We never claimed an overnight revolution. He thrust out a finger. Just admit it. You sold out the progressive agenda from day one. All your talk about net zero was hot air. Karoline's face remained serene. The data disagrees with you. Emissions from coal-fired plants have dropped significantly, while renewables are accelerating. For the first time in decades, we're modernizing our entire energy grid. That's not a sellout. That's progress. Harrington smirked. We'll see how history judges your so-called progress. He sat, arms folded. Once again, he had tried, and failed, to spark a meltdown. In the months that followed, Karoline pressed on, delivering detail-laden briefings and championing incremental victories. Harrington remained a thorn in her side, continuing to push the narrative that the bill was a half-measure rife with corporate giveaways. Yet, ironically, Harrington's repeated attempts to be thrown out only made him look desperate. A few times, other reporters confronted him, telling him to respect the basic order of the briefing room. The White House security never gave him the spectacle of a forceful removal that he wanted. Over time, his stunts became predictable. Eventually, Harrington wrote an article titled, "A Year In, Where We Stand with the Infrastructure Bill." It still criticized the White House, but conceded that the bill's green portions were not negligible. He slammed transitional fuels and a slow timeline, but parted with a grudging note that the administration had at least achieved real policy changes. Karoline read it, sensing a tiny shift, less shrill, more factual. Perhaps Harrington recognized that while the bill wasn't ideal, it was far from the doomsday scenario he'd predicted. Of course, his next article accused the White House of hiding cost overruns. Such was Harrington's dual nature, ever seeking the next angle to provoke outrage. And Karoline, for her part, continued to face him in nearly every briefing, unwaveringly repeating data, clarifying expansions, and refusing to let him derail the discourse. They never became friends. They never reached a warm rapport. But in their own unspoken way, they settled into a standoff defined by mutual tenacity. Harrington forever battling for the perfect gotcha moment, Karoline forever deflecting it with unshakable calm. That tension, ironically, served the public interest. Harrington's aggression forced clarity, and Karoline's composure upheld professionalism. Thus, the Infrastructure Renewal Bill persisted, like democracy itself, an imperfect, evolving beast shaped by compromise, ambition, and ceaseless scrutiny. Karoline Leavitt and James Harrington, two polar opposites in method and temperament, played their roles in a drama that exemplified the best and worst of Washington. Determination clashing with spectacle, facts wrestling with spin, and a final, tenuous resolution somewhere in the middle.